Today is Tuesday, February 13th, 2024. I'm David Berlin, and this is the Blockchain Journal podcast. And today, my guest is Daniela Barbosa. She is the executive director of the Hyperledger Foundation. And it's been about a year, maybe a little bit more, since I last spoke with her in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum. So I thought it would be fun to catch up with her, learn a little bit more about what she's been doing in that last year, what the Hyperledger Foundation is up to, and even just get a reminder about what it is the Hyperledger Foundation does. So Daniela, welcome to the Blockchain Journal podcast.
Hey, David, thank you for having us on again. It's great to see a lot of the success and the content and really the stories that you've been building in the industry. So thank you.
Thank you. And we hope to tell a little bit about the Hyperledger story today. And for those of you who are watching, by the way, you're going to see a ton of QR codes. You've probably seen them in the lower thirds, like below my photo and my picture and all that, below Daniela. But at the end, we will also put some QR codes up so you can not only find both of us on our various social networks, but you can also use those QR codes to find where Blockchain Journal is and where the Hyperledger Foundation is and so on. So anyway, let's get started. What is the Hyperledger Foundation?
All right. Well, the Hyperledger Foundation, since 2016, we've been the home for blockchain and blockchain-related projects at the Linux Foundation. So for those of you who don't know the Linux Foundation, essentially over the last 25 years, the Linux Foundation has been the home for the most important open source projects in the world. Obviously, our own namesake, the Linux kernel, but also projects like under cloud native computing with Kubernetes, automotive grade Linux that's driving a lot of the electronics and the operating system in cars, and even in the AI space with PyTorch as part of LF Data and AI. So the goal at the Linux Foundation is to really bring the technologies that want to be openly developed and openly governed that are going to be critical in infrastructure. And I would say, David, pretty much every piece of technology that you've touched today has probably some piece of Linux Foundation code, open source code, as an underlining piece of that.
There's no question about that. I am totally aware of that, and I can't say how appreciative I am of that. And I want to kind of connect open source to how blockchain works a little bit later and just get your feedback on that. But let's keep going about the Hyperledger Foundation.
So in 2016, a bunch of large enterprises, banks, technology players came together and said, hey, this is interesting. This blockchain technology, decentralized technologies, or distributed ledger technology is interesting. And we want to collaborate on building these technologies collaboratively, right? And what you get when you do open source and open development, you get accelerated, product timelines, essentially, right? You're collaborating on the things that need to be built together. So in 2016, the project that was called the Hyperledger project at the time was formed. In 2016, one of our first projects was Hyperledger Fabric, followed by Hyperledger Sawtooth, Iroha, and Explorer, just in that first year alone. And what we learned as a community was that the enterprises were very interested in the technology of blockchain, not the speculation of Bitcoin. And even at the time, the Ethereum mainnet had just launched, the year before. But the technology, seeing that the technologies itself, and you'll hear me keep going back to this, could bring efficiencies to market, right? Could bring, 24/7 liquidity to market, could bring decentralized identity and privacy to the market. So in 2015, the Hyperledger project at the time was formed. And throughout we're just celebrating our 8th year anniversary this year, we've really nurtured and recruited and accepted what I think are some of the most important, will be the most important open source projects that enterprises, that governments, and essentially that new financial infrastructure, for example, is being built on. So we're very proud of what we've built over the last 8 years, and the market has changed. And I'm sure, David, you and I have talked about this before, and we'll talk about it today. The market has changed at what blockchain or distributed ledger technologies or decentralized technologies are needed in the enterprise today, even very differently than what everyone thought was going to happen in 2015 and 2016. So if you look at the Hyperledger Foundation, our timeline of projects and the community members that have come to join us, it really matches where the enterprise is going with these technologies. And for that, in 2021, we rebranded to the Hyperledger Foundation because we are a true umbrella of multiple projects, multiple communities that ultimately are working with the key thing, which is open source, open development, and open governance in the Hyperledger Foundation umbrella. So I'm excited to give you some of those updates today.
Great overview. Would you say Fabric is the flagship of the whole portfolio, or is it more kind of even balanced across all the different projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you and I were speaking in 2017, 2018, I would say definitely Fabric was the key. And it happens to be Hyperledger Fabric is still the most adopted permission distributed ledger platform in the marketplace. And we have, data that, proves that. And you see the use cases as well. But today,
well, let's just stop there, because I think, there are people in the enterprise who are still getting familiar with blockchain terminology. And you said permissioned distributed ledger.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And what is the difference between that and some other distributed ledgers that are out there?
Right. So a couple of things. And even today, it's not just private and public. It's not just permissionless and permissioned. There's actually a continuum of different use cases that perhaps use a public blockchain to anchor, for example, transactions on a layer one, right? And it could be, a layer one that you might know, like the Ethereum ecosystem, the Ethereum mainnet, but it can also be on a layer two, right? Like the Polygons of this world. But it can also be on a layer one that is purposely built for enterprise use cases, like Casper, for example, or Hedera, and more and more. In 2016, you probably talked to a lot of us and we would say, there's not going to be hundreds of blockchains. There's going to be, there won't be one to rule them all, but there'll be, a few. And you'll see there's actually a lot of diversity. So when you think about a permissioned distributed ledger, it is a network, it's a blockchain network that anyone that's participating in that network is a known entity, right? That's someone that comes in, you have to meet certain criteria from a governance perspective to participate, to run a node, to write into the network. So it's a permissioned everybody that you have status. A permissionless blockchain basically means that anyone can read and write, and you don't need to identify what that individual or that organization is reading and writing into the public blockchain. What you see is a lot of work that's happening in the layer twos, and some people even start calling it layer threes, where the security, right, and the access of the public permissionless blockchain is being leveraged as well for enterprise use cases, with governance, for example, being still permissioned. And I have examples, and I can certainly take you through it. But when I talk about the portfolio under the Hyperledger Foundation umbrella, is we now have 13 different projects that address different requirements of what enterprises are done. Hyperledger Fabric, continues, as I mentioned, to be a distributed permissioned ledger. Then we have projects, for example, like Hyperledger Besu, which came into the foundation in 2019. And Hyperledger Besu actually has two communities. They work very closely together. One is the Hyperledger Besu as an execution client on mainnet, so public blockchain. Hyperledger Besu runs as an execution client on the Ethereum public blockchain. And about 14 to 15% of mainnet today is actually running Hyperledger Besu as a public execution client. And that's very important just for diversity's sake on the public Ethereum network. Client diversity is really important, because if you have everybody running the same client and something goes wrong, there's a huge bug in that client, what do? The network has to fork, or you have to figure out, do we push this back? So client diversity is really important. So Hyperledger Besu has a very, very active and growing mainnet as an execution client. And then it also has Hyperledger Besu as an EVM, which stands for the Ethereum virtual machine. So you can run a permissioned network using the Besu EVM, and it has all the characteristics that happen on mainnet. So if you have a token standard, an ERC as it's called in the Ethereum ecosystem, you have an ERC token standard, you can natively run that on a Hyperledger Besu permissioned network. The optionality, and whether it's Fabric or Besu or even Iroha and other projects that we have, the optionality is really important for the enterprises, as many of them are trying to figure out where and how they build, and how they build to scale, not just to scale in transaction numbers, right? Because it's really important, but to scale in the longevity of what they're building. Imagine you're a big bank, right? And you're building a digital assets platform, a DApp, and you don't want to have to rebuild that thing in 3 years time or 5 years time or 10 years time. So projects like Hyperledger Besu, which are aligned with mainnet, Ethereum mainnet, will always, for example, always have the best of both worlds as well.
So
and
you
there's
don't
a lot
have
of
to,
support.
if you're an enterprise, you're not faced with the constant reinvention or creating your own code base. It's the same story that you get from a lot of different open source projects, not just in the blockchain industry, but you do have a very vibrant community of developers and the underlying code base, to whether it's clients or EVMs or whatever it may be, is always evolving in a way that the enterprise can sort of depend on it to be there, not just now, but in 2-3 years or 5 or 10 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I always, when I talk about the Hyperledger Foundation, it's really 3 pillars, right? One is we are a developer community, right? We are all about our developers, our maintainers, our contributors, the people that build the code, the people that, support the code. So making sure that the developer community has the tooling that they need, that they have the governance that they need, right? The tools to make them successful. And very importantly, that it is under an open governance model, right? Which means that anyone can participate. It's not just one company that basically says, we're going to just build this and we're going to do it based on what we need for our own customer base. So our developer community is really important. And so one pillar, and the most important, is shepherding that open source community in the world. The second pillar is education and training, right? So the Hyperledger Foundation, we do a lot of education. You probably took the first course, the learning, the intro to blockchain that came out in 2017. I think we've educated close to 300,000 people. I was just at CES the other day and some guy came up to me and he's like, hey, all I do now is Bitcoin, but I want to let you know, if it wasn't for the Hyperledger intro to blockchain course that I took, 5 years ago, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So we've actually educated, and that's just one example. And we have certification courses. Engineers can be certified on Hyperledger Fabric or other projects as well. We're just working on Besu. So education, and part of that is making markets, right? And is how do you bring this technology to the forefront of companies that maybe are not at that technology level, talking about the things and the benefits that blockchain can bring to an industry, talking about the efficiencies that we can bring to market. So we have the developer ecosystem and our role in shepherding and making sure that developers have the tools that they need to be successful, and the support, the education and the training. And the third pillar is the commercial ecosystem, because you might have some really great, engineers who are really smart and doing a lot of stuff. And you might have trainings for people to figure out how to use it. But if you don't have a strong commercial ecosystem, someone that a big brand, for example, can pick up the phone and say, hey, I want to build this out, but I don't have 100 engineers on site to support this. How do I go about doing that? So building that commercial ecosystem. And over the years, you've seen, the commercial ecosystem, mature from, hey, everything is bespoke, right? If you want something in blockchain, you got to build it out from scratch, to, hey, you know what? There's blockchain as a service, right? There's a lot of blockchain as a service providers that offer multi-chain, options. There's, what I call middleware service providers. So the market, as they mature, we want to make sure that there is a healthy and growing commercial ecosystem on top of these open source projects as well. And I can talk about,
I just want to go back to the discussion around Besu. You mentioned that it's very much tied to the permission networks, but it's my understanding that the EVM, the Besu EVM, is also being used on several public networks. Isn't that true?
Yeah. So Besu has, essentially, think of it, Besu has two sides, and I'll tell you why it's really important to enterprises that Besu is actually in the Hyperledger Foundation, because of the open governance and the way that we operate at the Linux Foundation, all our open source code bases. So if you look at Hyperledger Besu, there is one part of Besu which is the mainnet execution client.
Right.
So around 14 to 15% today, as I checked earlier today, about 14 to 15% of the Ethereum mainnet, right? So the Ethereum blockchain is already running Hyperledger Besu as an execution client. So since the merge, since the Ethereum merge when it went to proof of stake, the Ethereum blockchain has execution clients and consensus clients, all right? So Besu is one, and right now I think it's number 3 of the execution clients running mainnet. We have maintainers who are very focused on that, all the releases that come up, all the bugs that need to get fixed, and that needs to be real time. Like, you cannot wait, and go through many decisions around, do we make this change, right? It needs to support that. Besu has the EVM permissioned maintainer community, right, that is working in parallel to what's happening with mainnet. So they're taking all the great stuff that are happening in mainnet. We'll always have parity. So for example, as I mentioned, the ERC tokens, right? If you have a new token that launches on the Ethereum mainnet, you want to implement that token as in your permission network, Besu will support that as well. But Besu on the permission side, right, we have a set of maintainers that are really working on critical things that are important to the enterprise. David, you know this. Banks, when they're implementing software into their system, right, it's not like, hey, I'm putting a Besu node here or a Fabric node here, right? It integrates with a lot of different systems. There's a lot of regulatory requirements, that you have to go through, like a 17 SOC, paper before even a bug fix gets pushed through. So accommodating that and making sure that the parity with mainnet continues, yet the innovation gets pushed into the enterprise EVM for Besu is a very important reason why Besu is so attractive to enterprises today, because once again, that longevity of the project with what's happening in mainnet as well. And that community continues to grow. And I'll give you examples of private permissionless networks as well, if you're interested in that.
So all the talk around open source and the governance model, I just want to I mentioned earlier that I want to come back to that, because when I'm telling people about blockchain, particularly public blockchain, the most common question you get is, why do I need blockchain for this? I just have a database or something like that. And I just want to kind of try this argument out with you to see what you think. When you think about open source, you particularly think about the history of open source. Remember when it first came out, there was a lot of pushback, especially from enterprises. Enterprises were like, are you crazy? We're gonna adopt some kind of software where everybody can see the source code. And of course, the proponents of open source would say, that's the benefit. Everybody can see it. Let's look at some of the commercial operating systems, the proprietary ones that are on the market right now. And why do you think they have so many security problems? Because there's not enough eyeballs on the source code. And therefore, the source code is insecure. You have all kinds of problems. And people paid a very dear price for some of those problems that were in the source code of some of the proprietary operating systems, compared to, let's say, Linux. So, I think about that. And I think about how that open source nature of Linux and other projects just made them more secure, right? And it's basically because you're outsourcing, you're crowdsourcing the development of the code and the securing of the code. In many ways, when you think about what public blockchain is, you're outsourcing consensus. You are doing the exact same thing. You're taking the consensus algorithm out of the hands of the one or two people, like you have happening with the development of proprietary operating systems at some software company. You're taking that out of the hands of just a handful of people who can't possibly cover the entire landscape or code base and keep it secure. And you're putting it out there so that everybody participates in the process in a way that makes it more secure. And a couple times I've explained that to people, and they're like, and then they come back, oh yeah, but proprietary software isn't that much less secure than open source. So we get back into that debate, but I still think there's a parallel there. I don't know what you think about that argument.
Yeah, I think in decentralized technologies, open source is one. There is no doubt. You cannot have a decentralized system without having access to the code, right? And being able to look at it, being able to make suggestions to it. So I think and it's two arguments. You asked is blockchain and open source needed? And there's many use cases. Look, David, there are so many use cases that people went down the route of saying, I'm going to build something with blockchain when they should have just built it with
Oracle database.
An Oracle database or a database, for sure. Have no doubt about it, right? And very often when I joined Hyperledger in 2017, we actually used to get those calls. I would get on the call, and people would be like, "Hey, I just came out of a C-level meeting, and they said build something in blockchain," and I'd be like, "No, that's not the way to do it." So that's one point on the open source thing, and I truly just believe if decentralized, anything that is going to be decentralized has to be open sourced. There's a big difference between open source of you can look at the code, right?
Yeah.
And you can see it versus you can actually become a contributing member to the governance of the code as well. And I've seen even in the public blockchain space on all the layer ones and some of the layer twos as well, you see the work that they're doing towards being more open about the code development and governance of it, because ultimately it's going to be very important from a security perspective, from an audit perspective, from a regulatory perspective, right? If regulators are going to look at this and say, who essentially has control of the code? Is it two guys in the basement in Singapore? And how is that okay? It's a joke because I believe there's no basements in Singapore. They're all garages, but that's what I mean. But you know what I mean? There's, so it needs to be not just open source, it needs to be openly governed.
But can't the same be said for consensus? Can't you say, hey, look, this is a better system because it's all equally decentralized, and therefore, you don't have one or two people who are in control of the data, right? That's that's why Bitcoin happened, right? Because somebody was incentivized to disintermediate the banks because whatever the bank said went. Bank said X, it was X. The bank said Y, it didn't matter. Whereas a distributed ledger kind of disintermediated that whole idea. So it seems to me like in both cases, you're kind of saying, hey, let's turn over the sanity of this whole system to a greater number of people in the way that no single party controls it.
And this is why consortium-based blockchain networks are important, and not consortium in maybe in the traditional sense of what you think about a consortium, but where the governance and the consensus still has the ability of who is governing, right, and who's part of that consensus. It's not just everybody that shows up. So I'll give you examples of things that we are seeing in the ecosystem that I think are very promising, because it's actually governments and government entities that are thinking about leveraging the core blockchain principles of decentralization, right, and permissionless access, but creating basically utilities that are bringing what to the market? They're bringing efficiencies. They're bringing liquidity into the market. So I'll give you examples of that. So down in Latin America, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank have worked with the community in Latin America and the Caribbeans to build out a platform called LACchain. LACchain, think of LACchain or LACnet as a layer one, a public utility blockchain network, right? So everyone can see, everyone can participate, anyone can, right? It's an open blockchain, just like Ethereum, just like Bitcoin. But they have embedded governance because there's a requirement, right? Because they're running government use cases around digital identity, and they have embedded governance into that network. They're using Hyperledger Besu to create that environment. So it's a public utility layer one blockchain, and the governance of that layer one blockchain, which is called LACnet, is permissioned, and the governments and the participating members of LACchain are so who is participating in that as well, right? And that's important for that. That's happening in Europe with EPSI, the European Blockchain Services Institute. They're doing a lot European-based funded project, a layer one blockchain, utility blockchain that is permissionless, that has permissioned governance alongside of it, and they use Hyperledger Besu as well, and we have many of those use cases. So it's that optionality that I think is continues to be really important. Yeah.
It seems to me like you're talking about some of the nation states here, very large governments. The one pattern I've observed over the years, over the last year, where there have been some proof of concept projects around the idea of digital asset oriented national bank networks, things like that, right? Like almost exclusively, like if you think about national banks today, they currently run private permissioned networks. They're not blockchains. They're the existing financial rails that everybody's familiar with. But where those experiments are being conducted, it seems to me like most of those experiments are looking to somewhat replicate the permissioned nature of the existing networks because that's what makes them feel most comfortable. Or there's a blend of some sort, like it's very, as you were pointing out, you've got this permissioned governance piece, and maybe there's some permissionless component to it.
I mean, a lot of the reasons is there is no regulatory clarity of what they can and cannot do, and I think
at least not in the U.S. there isn't. Yeah,
it's coming out, but it's a long term.
Yeah.
So they do need to, you can't run a business without observing regulatory requirements,
Sure.
for sure. But but there are platforms, right, that are using blockchain, right? Take a look at JP Coin, for example, right? Take a look at some of the platforms that Goldman Sachs has out there with their dApps. And others, and I can go on and on, where they are using blockchain, but for what, right? They're not creating coins and speculative tokens to investment. They are once again trying to bring efficiencies to the market. Right, and efficiencies for these banks, and ultimately for the benefit of the consumers, whether it's individuals or the companies, right, that are moving money around, is efficiencies, creating 24/7 markets, right? If you've ever had to send money cross border from the U.S. to India or the U.S. to Brazil or whatever, the pain of doing that. Imagine that at the business level, right? So creating efficiencies in the market, creating 24/7 access. Liquidity, having actual liquidity be able to move around. So if you go and you buy something from a supplier in Southeast Asia, and how long does it take for that supplier once again to get access to the money, right? The money's been agreed to, the materials are on the move. And what do they want? They want the money so they can go and reinvest and go buy more
Sure.
stuff to make more stuff and make more money, right? So that liquidity is just locked up, right? So once again, it's about efficiencies to the market. They're not looking to tokenize things because they're going to make, they're going to sell NFTs on it, right? They're looking for efficiencies on the tokenization of the markets, and that's where I think you're seeing a lot of, I think, the important work that's happening, because financial infrastructure is getting very old, right? And I'm not just talking about, something breaks down and nobody knows how to, code in COBOL. I'm talking about the actual rails are not keeping pace to what the digital economy needs. And so you see some of the largest banks looking at blockchain, right? And whether they call it distributed ledger or blockchain or whatever they want to call it, to just make their business make more money and be more efficient at it, and hopefully the consumers win out on that.
I think you missed a third benefit, and you probably know about it. It just didn't cross your mind while you were spitting it all out. Is the cost? Yes, the liquidity. So the point about digital economy is very important. The reason that the merchant's product was on the move before they had access to the funds that compensate them for that sale or whatever is because of the digital economy. Like the deal was closed on the e-commerce form on some website, and it was a done deal. There was no opportunity, to have sort of a balanced delay on both sides of product delivery and the money. So you got to get the flow of the money has to catch up to the delivery of the product. I think that's what you're pointing out. But you also have the cost of the cross-border remittance that's happening, right? And so the best example I know of a proof of concept is between Shinhan Bank in South Korea, and Standard Bank in South Africa, where they did a proof of concept, and what it showed was not only was it the 24/7 hour nature. It just happened in seconds, or minimally a minute or something like that. So you had instant access, but it was also the cost of conducting that transaction wasn't $35 or whatever it is if you go out onto one of the existing rails. So you don't have the delay, you don't have the cost. The cost was like under a penny, right? And so I think about the volume. You talk about efficiency. I think of the volume of those types of transactions that are taking place across all financial institutions today. And let's roll the national banks into all of that. And the opportunity to just strip an incredible amount of cost out of the entire ecosystem, if we want to call it that, is just it's mind-boggling. And so you can understand why JP Morgan's doing JPM coin, because look what they are experiencing, the benefits of the reduced cost and the 24/7 access to liquidity and the speed of the whole system.
Right. And it's that trust, and when people say, well, couldn't you do that with the blockchain? You could, but you need to have those third-party intermediaries, and who trusts which database, and how do you reconcile the database, right? And it all goes back to what the technology does, not how the technology is being, constantly talked about in the media, that it's, cryptocurrencies and it's just, speculative funding. So I think if you go back to the question of why use a database versus a blockchain, David, you just answered it, right? Why are these big banks and government agencies, for example, and things trying to, just build new infrastructure that can actually scale and continue to scale to what the market needs? And whoever does that right, and the partners and the collaboration that do it right, they're going to just, move faster in the market. And ultimately, I think that's what all enterprises want.
Well, if you get a few banks saving $25 at scale across millions and millions of transactions, those banks are just going to have a competitive advantage over the banks that aren't doing it, strictly on the basis of cost. There's two ways you can make a profit, right? Reduce your costs or increase your revenue. They're both equally valuable, and this one is a major league cost reducer. I want to switch gears because we talked a lot about the pros and cons of Hyperledger, what Hyperledger is, the open source nature, different projects that you have going, benefits of permission versus permissionless networks and all that. You've got some announcements. You've had a couple things happen. You've got a new announcement just this week, something called Web3J. So let's talk about some of those.
And I'll take a step back, right? Because if you think about, and I mentioned Fabric, I mentioned Bezu, Iroha is another project that's been graduated as a distributed ledger. And when you start thinking about actually implementing blockchain networks, let's go back to the big banks, right? There are other things that are required in order for these systems to talk to one another. So, for example, interoperability becomes a very important aspect of these networks, right? It is not one network to rule them all. It's networks of networks. So how do you move these assets securely, right, from one network to another that might have different DLT frameworks? They're using different technologies. So if you look at the timeline of the Hyperledger Foundation from 2016 to today to 2023, you see projects coming in that address the production needs of these networks and implementations. So we have a project, for example, called Hyperledger Cacti. And Cacti was started in 2020, called Cactus at the time. And it really came from, these big companies, Accenture, Fujitsu, IBM, that were building these networks, right? Building these networks for their customer bases, and interoperability between networks became important, right? You're running an R3 Corda network, and I'm running a Hyperledger Bezu network. How do our networks interact with one another? So interoperability becomes really key. So Hyperledger Cacti is one of those projects, and we just graduated. We have a project lifecycle where these enterprise code bases go through a project lifecycle, and it's really important for enterprise code, right, that it goes through that process. So Hyperledger Cacti just graduated into our project umbrella as a graduated project. And that's great to see. And why did they do it? Because they have adoption. There's users using it. There is a need, and new people are contributing and developing. Another project that just graduated in October as well is Hyperledger Firefly. So Hyperledger Firefly is essentially, a supernode, but it's a middleware. If you think about having to build out these blockchain systems, you have to build out the digital assets, you have to do the connections into your legacy systems, right? You have to do a lot of things, identity, you have to do everything. And so Hyperledger Firefly is that building block. And you can say, once again, I am using Fabric, or I'm using Besu, or I'm using, Polygon or Avalanche, right? It doesn't matter which distributed ledger platform you're using. A tool like Hyperledger Firefly really gets people to go into play. And so over the years, we've adopted and brought in projects that really address the needs of the community. Last year, we had a project come in called Hyperledger Solang, which is essentially a Solidity compiler for Substrate. All right. And this year, so just this week, we announced Web3J, and it's a Java and Android library for working with smart contracts. This Web3J has been in the ecosystem for a long time. I believe it started in 2016, probably around the same time as the Hyperledger Foundation. A huge adoption, and the maintainers, a company called Web3 Labs, understand that for Web3J to get further ingrained into the enterprise space, right, to bring more contributors into that bringing it to a foundation like the Hyperledger Foundation is a good home for it. So
the J stands for Java, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a Java-based Android library, and you know the enterprise, they love Java.
Well, I mean, that's the key is it's like if you want enterprises to adopt some technology, you're going to have to find a way for them to have kind of an easy on-ramp to that technology. Right. And so for those enterprises, and there are a great many of them who are heavily invested in Java, if you think back to the days of all the, J2EE servers and all that, bridging Java to the blockchain world just seems like a very natural thing that enterprises will appreciate having something like an open source project dedicated to.
Yeah. So Web3J, it's a library, it's a tool, right? Tooling. How do you get people to onboard, right? The concept is you don't have to start from scratch anymore, right? You don't have to download, a DLT and start from scratch. There is tooling that is built now on top of it. And at the Hyperledger Foundation, what our goal is to find basically the best technologies that we believe in the long run win in the enterprise space, right? That we can bring the enterprise developers to, that they can contribute, they can participate. And that's kind of, the bet that we made in 2019 when we brought Hyperledger Besu over. I think, David, I've told you the story before. If I didn't physically get black eyes, but myself and at the time our executive director, Brian Bellendorf, got, black eyes about bringing, an Ethereum distributed ledger project into the community. But the need was for the enterprise, right? They were saying, we need this, and we need something that we can collaborate on, that can be, governed under Hyperledger, that gives a space for growth and enterprise exception. And then that third pillar, right, which is the commercial ecosystem, that we have commercial ecosystem support of these technologies. So even like Web3J, what we're hoping is that you could be an end user and you can use a tool like this, but if you want to call up a vendor and say, hey, I need help with this, that there's going to be in our vendor directory member companies that support Web3J, that support Fabric, that support Besu, and it makes those code projects really usable in the enterprise space for sure.
Typical open source commercialization model. Well, Daniela, I just want to thank you so much for your time.
No
I know you're very busy. You got wearing multiple hats. I heard. You've got your job as the executive director there at the Hyperledger Foundation, but you also are heavily involved in the Linux Foundation, which is kind of the bigger umbrella of all of this. So thank you very much for your time.
Not a problem. There's great work happening at the Linux Foundation, certainly at the Hyperledger Foundation. And it's because of our community and our enterprise members and the communities who contribute that we're able to do what we do. So thank you for giving us the time.
Always a pleasure to have you, and look forward to the next time we get together. We've been speaking with Daniela Barbosa. She is the executive director of the Hyperledger Foundation, and you will be able to look at the QR codes right after we're done talking here to see where it is you can find her and find the Hyperledger Foundation. You'll also see some QR codes for where you can find Blockchain Journal and all of our other great video content. We're available not only on the blockchainjournal.com website, but also on YouTube. And all of our podcast content is available in an audio-only format through the various podcasting services, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, etc. So you can find us just about anywhere. We like to meet our audience where our audience is. We don't make you come to us. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay tuned for more videos.